So you've been hanging out with us at all over the last couple of weeks. You know we've been journeying through the book of First Kings, and in many ways it's the story of the continuation of the kingdom of Israel, the nation of Israel, under the Davidic kingship. So David was king of Israel in 2 Samuel, and it was a high point, a high moment for the nation of Israel. And then his son Solomon comes to power here in the beginning of 1 Kings as David dies. And if you've been with us, you know we've been kind of pointing out that this transition is not going great. It's kind of uneasy. There's good and there's bad, and there's a whole bunch of gray area. Where do we know that Solomon's doing the right thing? Is David doing the right thing? And so it's kind of an uncertain transition as it's happening. And as we pick up in 1 Kings chapter 3 this morning, we're going to find a whole bunch more uncertainty that is going to lead to a profound moment of God's pursuit of Solomon and therefore Israel, that in so many ways is going to set the table for us to understand what is meant to happen in this book and how we can actually understand it moving forward. So, if you have a copy of the scriptures, you can turn to 1 Kings chapter 3. If you don't know worries at all, we'll always have verses up on the screen so you can follow along. This is what the storyteller says. It says, Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord, and the wall around Jerusalem. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places, because the temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the instructions given him by his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burnt incense on the high places. The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important of the high places. And Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream. And God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." And Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on the throne this very day. Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child, and I do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, "Since you have asked for this and not for a long life or wealth for yourself, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal amongst other kings. And if you walk in obedience to me and keep my decrees and commands as David your father did, I will give you a long life." Then Solomon awoke, and he realized it had been a dream. He returned to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then he gave a feast for his entire court. Word of God for the people of God. So here we have David completely off the scene and Solomon ruling, and as I've tried to suggest in the intro here, ruling at some level of confusion or naivete, uncertainty, and we pick up on that because of the first couple of verses of the chapter. Did you pick up on some of that? Let me help in pointing it out. The first thing that is mentioned, and anytime the storyteller mentions little bits of information, they are important to the story, right? They're there for a reason. They're not just one-offs. And so in the story, the first thing that we hear is that Solomon has made an alliance with Pharaoh in Egypt, right? So in chapter 2, you have all this consolidation that Solomon is doing, and I had suggested to you, probably incorrectly. And here again, Egypt being the main proponent of Israel's enslaved past, you have some that God would give in 2025, right? Let's remember the time that we're in, and let's remember the circumstance and the reason for it. This is not an ethnic thing. This is not a racial thing. This is about covenant relationship to God. And so God is interested in his people marrying other people who are also in a covenant relationship with God. That principle still applies today. Now, are there racists and bigots in our world who base a fear of interracial marriage on Old Testament texts like this? There sure are. But you know what I say about them? They're racists and they're bigots. They're not people who rightly interpret Scripture. What God is after here is not that, Egyptians are bad. It's that they are living in worship to all kinds of other gods, and they're not covenant people. And more often than not, that ends up in God's people living the Egyptian way, not the Egyptians living God's way. So too for you. And I tell it to my boys all the time, all right? As they're off at college and meeting new people and stuff. It matters in your relationships, especially the most intimate of your relationships, that you are connecting with people who deeply hold the same values that you do. That is not to dismiss the value of all people. That's not the case. But to understand that those who you most closely share your life with are going to deeply impact you, and therefore, you ought to be looking for people in a spouse or in the closest of friends who are also people who are following Jesus and striving to live the human life in the way that God intended it. That's the purpose of this first verse here. And we see Solomon, in fact, not doing it, right? What's fascinating, though, is that we do get a super positive statement about Solomon, don't we? It says he loved God and followed his ways. This is what I'm talking about. There's this weird confusion where at some level, Solomon is well-intended. He loves God. He wants to do the right thing. He wants to follow him, and yet is completely unclear about how to really do it. And again, this points back to David, his father, in not the greatest light, right? What better teacher could he had about what it means to be king, to follow God's ways, what the law says, etc., than David? And here we have the early statements about his kingship being someone who's at the very least wandering into gray areas, but more than likely actually stepping outside of God's intention. And it's not just about this unholy alliance with Egypt. It's also that Solomon is worshiping at the quote-unquote high places. Now, to the average reader, you're like, well, so what? Isn't that what people did? Yeah. But in the Old Testament, the phrase high places is almost always associated with idolatry or other gods. Now, it's clear in this passage that Solomon is not worshiping other gods, but he's worshiping God as if he were one of the other gods. Does this make sense? You kind of get the picture I'm talking about here? And so he's doing these offerings at these high places. And we know this is not good because in that whole phrase, you remember, there's that very strong contrasting conjunction, except. And in the Hebrew, it's even stronger, right? It says he loved God and walked in his ways, except that he was sacrificing to God in the high places. What's even more challenging, damning, whatever word you want to use in this situation, is it's not just Solomon who's worshiping God in the high places, it's also all of Israel. And the storyteller points out why this is happening. Why is it happening? Because God's house, the temple, is yet to be built in Jerusalem. Now, you have to have some knowledge of 2 Samuel to understand this. But in 2 Samuel chapter 7, David, who was Solomon's father and who was king, wanted to build God a house, wanted to build God a temple. And God said, it's actually not for you to do, it's for your son to do. And so it was Solomon's job to build God the house. Again, this is not looking great on David and communicating to Solomon all that he was meant to do and intending to do. And so you have Solomon, who instead of getting to the main task of business, which would be building a house for God, is off making unholy alliances and worshiping God as if he were one of many gods, right? And so we have a king of Israel kind of walking in uncertainty, right? We're very clear he loves God, he's well-intended, but he's uncertain of how to do any of this. What's more, when we get into this discussion between Solomon and God in Solomon's dream, we find out more of the state of being of Solomon, don't we? He says to God, listen, I'm only a child. Now, is this true? Was Solomon a kid ruler? Probably not. Most historians think he was probably in his early 20s, something like that, which in that day was plenty old enough to kind of know what was what and what it meant to be king and all of those things. And then the verse that we read here in the NIV was really almost an interpretation of the original language, which is fine sometimes. In the original, here it said he didn't know how to do the things God called him to do. In the original language, it says, I don't know how to come and go. Right? It's even more kind of a holistic claim about a state of being. Like, I don't even know how to do any of this stuff. I don't even know how to live. I don't know. So this idea of young child not know how to come and go, he's talking about his ability to live God's way, not his particular age. Does that make sense? And so we have in Solomon a self-assessment that, yeah, I'm kind of clueless. I love you, but I'm kind of clueless about how to do any of these things. And then we get to the most distinct moment of the whole book of 1 Kings. It is that God comes to Solomon. Now, you can't miss the significance of this. Solomon does not go to God. God comes to Solomon. And look where God meets Solomon. At Gibeon, at the high places, where Solomon is just worshiping God as if he were one of many gods and kind of living an uncertain, all over the place life. God inserts himself in that moment. Why? Because listen, even though as human beings, often at best, we are pursuing God in some level of uncertainty, at some level of unknowing, God is always pursuing us in perfection and willing to insert himself even in our error so that we stumble upon him in the right way instead of finding him perfectly in our own effort. Remember how I said during Advent that there's so many Advent stories in Scripture? This is another Advent story where God inserts himself into the mess of an experience so that he can be found and known. That's the story of Christmas, right? And here it is again. Once again, showing us what the storyteller wants us to see. That who is meant to be king of Israel? Solomon? Well, he's a good placeholder. But the true king of Israel is who? It's God. God is the king of Israel. He's the one who is pursuing it. Under Solomon's leadership, they're going to be worshiping God as if he's one of many gods in the high places, making alliances to try to fortify a kingdom in his own power. But God inserts himself for Solomon and therefore for all of his people. This is the God who we serve. This is the God who we love. This is the God who loves you. Don't believe some mischaracterization of who God is. Lovingly pursuing you for your rescue. Amazing. And so here he comes to Solomon in a dream. And the first thing he says to him, what an amazing moment this must be for any human being ever, right? First, probably utter terror. At some level, there's a recognition that Solomon's talking to the God of the universe, right? That would freak us out, I think, most of us. But then the God of the universe, all-powerful, creator of all things, says, hey, ask me for whatever you want and I'll give it to you, right? This is a moment all of us would long for, no doubt, right? Like, okay, right? An Eagles win at 3 o'clock this afternoon, or, whatever it might be that you really long for. But finally, Solomon knocks it out of the park, right? In this moment, Solomon asks for exactly the right thing. How does this happen? How is Solomon able to ask for exactly the right thing in that moment and not an Eagles victory or wealth or whatever trivial things we tend to think we need in the moment to have full life, right? And I don't think I need an Eagles victory for that. I'm just trying to be funny. But all of these things that we think we need that are fleeting in the moment. How does Solomon know to ask for this thing? There's two reasons, right? Solomon has a robust understanding of who he actually is. And he has a robust belief of who God actually is. And when those two things meet, you will always ask for exactly the right thing. When you know who God is, truly, and you are fully aware of who you are in that moment and holistically, you will ask for the right thing. And it's why the psalmist always says, ask whatever is in your heart, and God will give it to you. And some of us are saying, I've tried that, and it doesn't work, right? Because we haven't met that right intersection. To pray the prayers that God is absolutely saying yes to in the moment. But here Solomon does it, and we see it in perfection because it says, God was pleased. God was so pleased with him that he threw all kinds of extra blessing on him. So what is it then that Solomon asks for in this moment? Well, traditionally, we've all been told or understood that Solomon asks for wisdom, right? We've heard this before. Solomon, the wisest man of all, he writes the Proverbs, all these things. He's a wise guy. And so Solomon asks for wisdom. But that's actually not true, right? That's actually not what Solomon asks for in this moment. Did you hear what it said in the version that we read? It said that he asked for a discerning heart. Now here again, this is a wonderful translation of this verse, but here to be able to read it in the original language really makes it jump off the page. Do you know what he asks for? A heart that hears. This is exactly what he asks for. A heart that, to use the Hebrew language, a heart that shemas. Now, let's understand these two words so we can get really at the core of what's happening in this passage. What does it mean to hear? So in our English language, hear doesn't have the robust meaning that it would have had in the first century world of Jesus or in the even more years of antiquity of people like Solomon and David, etc., etc. In those days, to hear was to not only be able to, audibly hear or to process information, but to process information in a way that set you up to actually do it. Does that make sense? So, famously, the Hebrew word is shema, right? Shema. So there's this passage in the Old Testament that is often called the Shema. You ever heard this before? Deuteronomy chapter 6, right? Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And what does it say after that? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, etc., etc. That is, if you're ever going to do that, you've got to hear it with a disposition in order to get after it. And so Solomon is saying, I don't just need a written code of law and priests who can explain it to me at times. I need a heart that is able to hear it. in a way that moves me to want to live it. What a profound ask this is. We have to pause and define the word heart, too, because we screw this one up an awful lot. In our world, the heart is what? It's ooey gooey mush, right? It's Hallmark movies. It's whatever you want to call it, right? And that's great. That's wonderful. That's fair. That's our culture. We talk about heart. We love. In the in the world of Solomon, as well as in the first century world of Jesus, the heart was understood by people to be the center of volition. Okay? You felt things in your gut, but you did things from your heart. All right? We still talk about that. I feel it in my gut, right? We still have that phrase where we're not sure what it means. You felt things in your gut, but you did things from your heart. And so what Solomon is asking for here is the volitional center of his being to be able to process the heart of God in a way that moves him to action. Profound. Not ears that hear, not a brain that hears, not emotions that hear, but the very thing that moves me to purpose and do things to hear. Amazing. This is a profoundly incredible ask from Solomon. And the truth is, unless we have hearts, or whatever we want to call it in 2025, volitional centers, some people say that's the brain now, I don't know, that is purposing ourselves, intending to do, willing to do the things that God is calling us to do. Unless that part of us has ears to hear, we won't do, right? Because that part of us has ears to hear all kinds of things in this world. Right? You aren't just making decisions as you think you're making decisions. You are being informed in your decision making by all kinds of things in this world. So too was Solomon. He was aware of that. And so he said, I've got to have ears to hear, right? What an incredible prayer. What if you prayed that prayer? What if every day you were living into that reality that said, God, in my center of will, in my place of volition, in my decision making, in the place of intentionality in me, would you give me ears to hear your ways? Again, it talks about laws and whatever, but the better way to translate that is the ways of God. Because the law of the Old Testament was basically informing people how to live as a society in God's way. Imagine if the thing that was driving your decision making was the character and the way and the intention of God. How that would radically transform how you live and decide in this world. It's the very thing that Solomon asked for. Amazing. God says to him, deal. You get it? And because you've asked for this, I'm going to pour all kinds of blessing on you. Now imagine that. So you're going to get wealth, you're going to get power, all of these things. And we have to pause and ask ourselves for a minute, what? So he gets this one thing right, and all of a sudden he's going to be super wealthy and super powerful and all that stuff. So does that mean when we pray, if we happen to hit the jackpot in a moment, we're going to get all this external blessing that flows in our way? Well, we have to remember that Solomon was a different dude than us, right? He had a different calling, a different place in the world than we did. He was God's very representative to his people. And so, what God was giving Solomon was actually a way for God to declare his power to the whole onlooking world. Does that make sense? Because this was God's kingdom. And therefore, if the kingdom was powerful and wealthy and bountiful, then the God who gave it was also on display. This makes sense? In essence, what God is saying is, because you have asked for this thing, my glory is going to be able to be on display in your life in profound ways. Friends, so too us, if we be pursuing this thing. Again, not necessarily in wealth and in power and positions, but the glory and the majesty. Psalm 8, how majestic is your name. In the way you live, that is being declared and profoundly on display to the onlooking world. Friends, that is what it means to be human. That's why we walk this earth. That's God's full intention. And oh, by the way, we get to live in the blessing of that as well. Because a heart that hears God walks with God. And if you're with God, then you have full access to God. And therefore, as we've been talking about through this whole series, the peace that we long for, the contentment that we desire so deeply, the structure that we need, whatever it is, the things that your soul longs for at its depth become fully accessible to you in the presence of God with you. Your heart and your soul long for those things because they know they're unattainable in and of yourself. But when they open their ears to God, it also begins to open its hands to God, and it welcomes it in to your current experience. Amazing. And we're going to see, super quick, the grandeur and the glory of Solomon's kingdom because of God's blessing in his life. But that's not the point this morning. What is the transformation that we see in Solomon's life? Because at the end of this passage, he's yet to get the bountiful riches. He's yet to get all these other things. We're going to see some of that in the next coming weeks. But there's one thing that happens at the end of this little passage that shows us the profound transformation that happens in Solomon when he has a heart with ears to hear. Did you catch it? Well, what was happening before Solomon meets God in the dream? Solomon is off where? In the high places, worshiping God as if he was one of many gods. Well, what happens at the very end, Solomon wakes up, realizes it was a dream, and it says what? He immediately goes to where? Jerusalem. But particularly to where? The altar of the covenant. And he worships God there. All of a sudden, God is no longer one God of many, but the God of the covenant. All of a sudden, God is not the God who made a covenant with Solomon's dad, but the God who made a covenant with the people and with Solomon. Solomon's worship becomes more robust, more exact, more on point. Why? Because he's fully embraced who God actually is. And so too for us. How do you know that you have a heart with ears to hear? Your life is characterized by worship. And not just worship, but right worship. That does not mean that you're singing the right songs, right? It does not mean that you have the right instruments to sing the songs, because, friends, we remember that singing, though we do it every Sunday, and it's an important part of who we are as Christians, is a tiny little bit of what worship is. Worship is your whole life. Everything you do is an act of worship to one God or another. What if there actually was only one God, not a God amongst gods? How would that change how you live the entirety of your life? Now that's true and right worship. Isn't it amazing that when Solomon asks for a discerning heart, God answers him and says what? Because you have asked for this, not only will I give you a discerning heart, he says, but he also says what? And a wise heart. It's God who adds wisdom. It's not Solomon who asks for it. So what then is this whole concept of wisdom? And how does it relate to a heart that hears? Well, a heart that hears becomes a heart that is wise when it actually does what it hears. Does that make sense? So one person has said, and it's a fair definition of wisdom, that wisdom is right knowledge rightly applied. Right? So it's knowledge that is enacted in life. But if we go back to Deuteronomy, what is right knowledge rightly applied? This is what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 4. It says, observe them carefully, that is the ways of God, the laws of God. For this will show your wisdom and understanding to who? The nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. In God's economy, what is wisdom? Not just generic knowledge, generically rightly applied, but a full and right knowledge of the ways of God, fully and rightly applied in how we live and orient our lives. And what happens when we do that? The full glory of God is on display for the nations. We're living as true human beings in that moment. So a heart that hears is a person that worships. And worship looks like what? Singing? Sure. But way more than that, it looks like a life of wisdom. The ways of God lived out in all aspects of our life. Now listen, remember he said the reason Solomon's able to ask for the right thing is what? He has a full picture of who God is, and he has a right assessment of who he is. If in this moment you're saying, oh, this sounds so good, but you're also having a right assessment of who you are, you're saying, and I can't do this. Right? Because I'm having that right assessment. I had it all week as I prepared, and I'm having it right now as I share this with you, that I'll get this right, this percentage, not the wholeness of my life. We're dependent at some level. In the same way, the people would have been dependent upon Solomon to do this. They needed a king who could get this right. Why? Because their connection to God depended upon it. They were not able. And in the same way, and what we will find out, probably not next week, but beginning in the week after, and then for the rest of the book, is that you know who gets this wildly right? Not Solomon. Matter of fact, he's going to screw up royally. You're going to look at some of your big mess-ups in life, and you're going to be like, whoa, there's nothing like this dude, and nothing like his dad either, But the question is, okay, we can read about those, but what about the people? What about the people that he was leading? And what was the effect of his massive failures on the people he was leading who needed his perfection in order for God to be close? And the answer is, we've always needed God himself, not just a human king. And it forces us as readers and the people back then to have been immediately looking even beyond Solomon. David couldn't do it. Well, maybe the son of David could do it. Well, as it turns out, he can't do it either, is the main storyline of this book. But God has said there will be a son of David who will be able to do it. And that son of David's name is Jesus, whose lineage not only traces back to David, but himself is God. So that in Jesus' arrival that we celebrate in Christmas is the enthronement of the true king that we have always needed. A king who perfectly has a heart that hears from God. Listen to what Jesus says about himself in John chapter 5. Jesus is responding to the people who are questioning about what he says. He says, listen, very truly I tell you, the Son, that's himself, can do nothing by himself. This is the heart, right? This is the will. This is the volition. I don't just decide to do anything by myself. I can only do what I see my Father doing, because whatever the Father does, I also do. Well, this is a weird thing to say at some level, right? Because it makes sense to us. But what he's saying here is the very thing that Solomon asked for and was unable to follow through on, Jesus does perfectly. He has a heart that perfectly hears the Father and walks through his whole earthly life in perfect unity with the Father, never out of step, so much so that he says, listen, everything I'm saying to you is what I hear my Father already saying. And everything I'm doing is what I see my Father already doing. And it gets to its most profound climax where? In the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before he is crucified, when he is wrestling with who? The Father. About what? His heart, his will, right? Oh, God, I know what's happening tomorrow, and I really would not like to do it, right? If there's any other way. But what does he say? Not my will, not my heart, but yours be done. Perfect submission, perfect unity that leads to what? Jesus' death on a cross. Why? So that the sin and the brokenness of all of humanity that keeps us from being able to have a heart that hears can once and for all be dealt with. And that in the resurrection, not only has Jesus been fully resurrected, but resurrection power has been enacted for anyone who is in Christ. That even now, the Spirit is at work in the followers of Jesus, cleaning out our heart's ears so we can rightly hear. That one day when Jesus comes back, that moment we long wait for, we too will walk in perfect harmony with God. And society and the world will be free from brokenness, pain, sin, catastrophe, and damage. You want to know what a life of worship and wisdom looks like? You want to know what it looks like to have a heart that hears? Follow Jesus. You say, well, why doesn't God show up to me in a dream and ask me for whatever I want? I'll ask him for a heart that hears. Friends, he's done far greater for you. He himself has come in the person of Jesus, not in an altered state of mind in a dream, but in the flesh, and has given you the thing you probably actually wouldn't have asked for because you didn't know you actually needed. This is a God who loves you, who pursues you, who even though we are often walking around in this world half in and half out, maybe well-intended, but messing things up, says, here I am, meeting you even in the high places of Gibeon, saying, this is who I am. Will you acknowledge me as not just one of many, but as the only true God who longs to have a covenant relationship with you? That contentment and that peace and that longing that your heart has is fully available to you in God because of Jesus. Don't look to false gods in this world, and don't seek God amongst them. Have only ears in your heart to hear him. Can you pray with me? God, what an incredible moment. Profound. Solomon praying for just the right thing. We celebrate that, but none of it happens if you don't pursue him. So may we never celebrate anything without realizing it all starts with you. Thank you that you did not wait for us to realize that we needed Jesus, but you sent him into our mess. That you did for us even greater than Solomon by not saying, hey, what do you want? But saying, here's what you need. And that you are making us new and making us whole. Even though in this broken world we still don't hear perfectly and tend to listen to other things. Spirit, we want to hear. We want to hear only God. Would you make it be so? Would you allow in this church and in all churches that preach the truth of the gospel and are centered on Jesus, would you rise up congregations of right worship and right wisdom because of ears of the heart that hear, so that, not for our sake, but so that the people around us will look and see your glory. God, there are millions of books that teach us how to order our lives, that tell us what is wise, and we spend so much time trying to figure this stuff out. And here it is. So might we just bend the knee and say, yes, you are God, I am not. Your ways are greater than mine. I'll walk in them. Amen.